The ranch fell silent. The moment she unfolded the paper from Fort Worth, Silas stood in the barn doorway with cold rain dripping from the brim of his hat while Naomi held the creased payroll receipt beside the lantern flame. Somewhere behind the house, a gate slammed hard against the fence in the wind. She didn't look angry. She looked tired. And when Silas finally stepped toward her, she folded the paper once and asked him a question that made him stop cold. Silas Reed reached Bandera, with red dust gathered along the cuffs of his coat and a coil of fencing wire rattling softly in the back of the wagon. October had dried the hills to the color of old straw, and the wind coming off the Medina River carried the faint smell of cedar and horse sweat through town. He stopped first at Grainger's Hardware to collect the wire he had ordered 2 weeks earlier, signed the receipt with a carpenter's pencil hanging near the counter, then crossed toward the limestone depot where Pastor Vale had told him she would arrive. He expected nerves. Instead, he found composure. Naomi Carter stood near the depot bench with one scuffed brown suitcase resting beside her boot. Her dark coat had been brushed clean despite the road dust from Fort Worth, and both gloves were tucked neatly into one pocket, as though she disliked carrying unnecessary things in her hands. She was not scanning faces or wringing her fingers like someone waiting to be rescued. She simply watched the wagons moving through Main Street while sunlight caught the edge of her cheek beneath the brim of her hat. Silas removed his hat. "Miss Carter?" Her eyes moved toward him steady and direct. "Mr. Reed." No smile followed. Not coldness either, just caution. The ride north toward Reed Hollow Ranch took most of the afternoon. Wagon wheels cracked over dry ruts along Medina River Road, while scrub oak shadows stretched longer across the hills. Silas tried twice to begin the sort of conversation people expected between two strangers preparing to marry, but Naomi kept steering the talk elsewhere. "How far's the nearest water line from the north pasture?" she asked at one point. "Quarter mile, maybe less after winter rain. And your horses stay sound through colder months?" "Mostly, if the feed holds." She nodded thoughtfully, as if measuring the answer against something private. That unsettled him. By the time Reed Hollow Ranch appeared beyond the split-rail gate, the sun had fallen low enough to turn the barn roof copper red. Naomi climbed down from the wagon without waiting for assistance, though she thanked him quietly when he carried her suitcase onto the porch. Silas noticed her eyes move over the property almost immediately. The loose hinge hanging crooked on the tackroom door, the cracked blue coffee mug cooling beside the stove, the dining chair repaired so many times the wood no longer matched. She said nothing about any of it, which somehow felt worse. Inside, the house carried the stale stillness of a place lived in by one person too long. Silas pointed toward the small bedroom near the back window and explained where extra blankets were kept. Naomi listened carefully, removing her hat while he spoke. Her hair had been pinned neatly for travel, though a few loose strands had escaped near her temple during the ride. "You can settle in before supper," he said. "All right." Again, no complaint, no enthusiasm either. While beans warmed on the stove, Silas stood outside near the horse trough, pretending to check the harness straps. Truthfully, he was trying to understand why her silence bothered him so much. He had asked Pastor Vale for a quiet woman, someone steady, someone who would not bring more noise into a life already crowded with it. Now that quiet sat inside his own house, and he did not know what to do with it. Later that night, Naomi unpacked only half her belongings: one plain dress, a folded nightgown, sewing needles wrapped carefully in cloth. Before closing the dresser drawer, she took out the church marriage letter bearing both their names and folded it back into its envelope with slow, careful hands. Silas passed her doorway once on the way to his own room and noticed the lamp inside had already gone dark. He paused near the hallway table for a moment, listening to the old house settle around them. Then he lit the spare lantern and left it burning quietly as outside her door before turning away without a word. By the third morning, Reed Hollow Ranch no longer sounded entirely like a bachelor's house. Before sunrise, Naomi moved through the kitchen with careful steps, the soft scrape of flour against the mixing bowl carrying faintly through the hallway while coffee warmed on the stove. Silas came in from the barn with cold air clinging to his coat and found biscuit dough resting beneath a folded towel near the window. He stood there longer than necessary, one hand still holding his gloves. The room felt occupied now. Naomi looked up from the counter. "I wasn't certain how strong you take your coffee. However, you made it's fine." She nodded once and turned back toward the stove. Their conversations still moved carefully, like people crossing uncertain ground after rain. But over the next week, the house slowly began filling with ordinary things that had once disappeared from it. Cabinet doors closing softly, water heating before dawn, the faint sound of sewing thread pulled through cloth after supper. Silas noticed more than he admitted aloud. One evening, he came in from repairing fence posts near County Road 19 and found 3 of his work shirts folded neatly across the chair beside the stove. Naomi had mended the torn sleeves so carefully he struggled to find where the fabric had once ripped. She sat near the lamp with her sewing basket open beside her, glasses balanced low on her nose, while she worked on a saddle blanket worn thin at the edges. "You didn't have to fix those," he said. "They were worth fixing. That was all." A few days later, they rode into town together for feed and lamp oil. Mercer Feed and Supply sat beside Hollow Creek Mercantile, with wagon tracks pressed deep into the dirt outside the porch steps. Naomi stayed close enough to walk beside him, but never close enough to touch. Inside the store, conversations softened briefly when people realized she had come from Fort Worth alone. No one said anything rude, which somehow felt heavier. Silas noticed the way Mr. Mercer stopped polishing the counter when Naomi approached with the receipt book. He noticed 2 women near the flour barrels glance toward her before lowering their voices. He noticed Naomi notice all of it while pretending not to. On the ride home, he kept his eyes on the road. Naomi mistook the silence for embarrassment. That night, she unpacked the rest of her belongings halfway before stopping again. Her fingers lingered over the handle of the suitcase, as though she were deciding how permanent anything inside this house should become. Later, while wind moved softly through the porch screens, Naomi sat beneath the lantern repairing a torn saddle blanket for one of the ranch horses. Silas leaned against the porch rail nearby, sharpening a hoof knife with slow, steady strokes. The rhythm between them had begun finding shape even when neither spoke much. Then Naomi drew a quick breath. The needle had slipped into her finger. Silas crossed the distance before thinking and reached toward her hand instinctively. Halfway there, he stopped. His palm hovered uncertainly between them while Naomi pressed the small bead of blood against her thumb. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes." For a moment, neither moved. Then, Naomi held the blanket toward him along with the needle. "Can you keep this edge steady?" Silas took the leather carefully between his hands while she resumed stitching. Their shoulders nearly touched beneath the porch lamp, close enough for him to hear the slow rhythm of her breathing over the creak of the swing chains in the wind. Neither spoke again for a long while, but the silence no longer felt empty. Cold weather settled deeper across Bandera County by early November. The grass beyond Reed Hollow Ranch had gone pale and brittle, and each morning Silas broke thin ice from the horse trough beside the barn before sunrise fully reached the hills. Naomi had begun wearing one of her darker wool dresses while working around the house, sleeves rolled neatly at the wrist whenever she cooked or mended tack by the stove. Little by little, the ranch had fallen into a shared rhythm neither of them discussed aloud. Then Warren Pike arrived in town. Silas first saw him outside Hollow Creek Mercantile beside a freight wagon loaded with cattle contracts and supply ledgers tied in leather straps. Pike carried himself like a man accustomed to being listened to, clean boots despite the road dust and a silver watch chain crossing his vest. Naomi had been standing near the flour sacks comparing lamp oil prices with Mrs. Holloway when she looked toward the doorway and suddenly went still. Not frightened, worse than frightened, recognizing. Pike noticed her a second later. His expression shifted almost too quickly to catch before settling back into politeness. "Miss Carter," he said evenly. Naomi lowered the receipt book in her hands. "Mr. Pike." Nothing else followed. Silas felt the air around them tighten like fence wire pulled too far. On the ride home, wagon wheels rolled hard against the dry road, while cedar shadows stretched across Medina River Road. Naomi kept her gaze ahead, one gloved hand resting lightly against the seat rail. Silas almost asked who Pike was twice before deciding against it both times. He told himself it wasn't his business yet. That night, the house sounded different again. Supper passed mostly in silence except for the scrape of forks against plates and the soft ticking of the clock near the stove. Naomi washed dishes afterward with steady hands, but Silas noticed she dried each plate longer than necessary before setting it away. Within days, small things around town began changing. At Mercer Feed and Supply, conversations shortened when Naomi approached the counter. At Trinity Chapel, two women who had once nodded politely now offered only quick glances before turning elsewhere. Nobody accused her of anything directly. Nobody needed to. Rumors traveled easier than wagons in places like Bandera. Late Thursday afternoon, Silas came inside from repairing a gate latch near the south pasture and searched Naomi's sewing basket for spare thread to patch a split rein strap. Beneath folded cloth and needles wrapped in paper, he found an envelope, creased from being opened many times. Inside rested an old payroll receipt from the boarding hotel in Fort Worth. The paper carried signatures along the bottom edge and notes regarding missing office funds. Nothing named Naomi guilty. Nothing cleared her either. Silas stood there beside the kitchen table longer than he should have, reading the faded lines while wind tapped softly against the porch screen outside. When Naomi entered carrying firewood, she knew immediately something had changed. Silas folded the paper carefully and set it back inside the envelope. "I was looking for thread," he said. Naomi placed the wood beside the stove one piece at a time. "And?" He hated how uncertain his own voice sounded. "I found that instead." She looked at him quietly for a long moment. Then she nodded once, as if confirming something to herself more than to him. The next 2 evenings stretched thin between them. Silas spoke less. Naomi stopped asking whether he wanted more coffee before bed. Even the ordinary comfort growing inside the house seemed to pull back into separate corners. On the second night, Naomi carried her coat onto the porch after supper and sat beneath the lantern with both hands folded tightly in her lap. Wind moved cold across the fields beyond the fence line. Silas eventually stepped outside too. She did not look at him when she spoke. "If you want the truth, you can ask me directly before deciding who I am." Silas rested one hand against the porch rail. "I don't know what to believe yet." Naomi nodded slowly at that, though something behind her expression dimmed. "My whole life," Silas said carefully. "I've learned disappointment usually gets to a thing before trust does." For a while, neither moved. Then Naomi reached into her coat pocket, removed the envelope, and set it on the porch table between them. "Read it properly this time," she said softly. She walked back inside without another word. An hour later, when the night air turned colder, Silas quietly carried her coat from the chair, where she had forgotten it, and draped it across the porch railing beside the doorway before sitting down alone with the envelope still unopened in his hands. Winter settled over Bandera County slowly that year. Mornings arrived gray and brittle, with frost gathering along the fence rails beside the north pasture, and thin smoke rising from chimneys across town before sunrise. At Reed Hollow Ranch, Naomi began banking the stove fire before bed so the kitchen would hold some warmth by dawn. Silas noticed she always left one kettle filled beside the basin for morning coffee, even on days when the cold stiffened her hands while she worked. Small habits had begun attaching themselves to each other. One evening, while repairing a broken cinch strap beneath the barn lantern, Silas finally spoke without looking up from the leather in his hands. "My father used to fill every room he walked into," he said quietly. "Noise, anger, complaints about things nobody could fix. Naomi stood nearby sorting feed sacks that could still be patched for use. She said nothing. Silas rubbed a thumb across the worn buckle before continuing. After enough years of that, silence starts feeling safer than people do. The lantern flame shifted softly between them. I thought if I married, he admitted, quiet was the best thing I could ask for. Naomi rested both hands against the edge of the work table. And now? Silas finally looked at her then. Straight on. Now I think maybe I confused quiet with loneliness. Neither moved after that. The next few days carried a different kind of ease through the ranch house. Not happiness exactly. Something steadier. Silas began asking Naomi practical questions before making decisions around the property. Whether another barrel of oats should wait until spring. Whether the south fence line needed replacing now or after winter. Naomi answered thoughtfully each time, no longer sounding like someone preparing herself to leave. One cold afternoon, she sat near the stove, mending a wool coat while sleet tapped softly against the kitchen window. Silas entered carrying firewood and found her staring at the needle without sewing. After a moment, she said, "The woman I protected back in Fort Worth worked laundry at the boarding hotel. Younger than me. Her sister depended on her wages." Silas lowered the wood beside the stove quietly. Naomi kept her eyes on the torn sleeve in her lap. The owner's son had gambling debts. Money disappeared. Folks already expected less trouble. Believing it was someone like me, the words came plain, without bitterness. Somehow that made them land harder. "I thought the truth would matter eventually," she said. By the time I understood it wouldn't, the story had already settled where people wanted it. Silas stood there a long while before speaking. "You should have told me sooner," Naomi nodded once. "Probably, but I should have asked sooner too." That settled between them softer than an apology. A week later, Trinity Chapel held its winter church supper despite the cold. Folding tables filled the meeting hall with stew pots, biscuits wrapped in cloth, and coffee strong enough to carry through the room in waves. Naomi stayed near the back, helping Mrs. Holloway refill serving bowls while Silas spoke with neighboring ranchers beside the stove. Warren Pike arrived late. Silas noticed Naomi stiffen almost before he heard Pike's voice. The broker stood near the coat rack, speaking low to another cattleman, though certain words still traveled across the room. "Fort Worth boarding house," Pike muttered. "Missing payroll." The conversation around them thinned just enough to notice. Silas set down his coffee cup carefully. "Funny thing about rumors," he said evenly. "They usually say more about the folks carrying them than the person they're tied to." Pike looked toward him, but said nothing. Silas shrugged into his coat. A decent person ought to be judged by how they live now, not by stories passed around like poker cards. No speech followed, no argument. The room simply breathed again. On the ride home, Naomi sat beside him, wrapped in silence, while wagon wheels rolled through frozen dirt along Medina River Road. Snow threatened somewhere beyond the hills, though none had fallen yet. Back at the ranch, Silas stayed, in the barn oiling tack straps beneath the lantern, while cold air drifted through the cracked boards overhead. A few minutes later, Naomi stepped quietly inside, carrying his father's old wool coat folded across both arms. "You'll freeze out here," she said softly. Before he could answer, she lifted the coat around his shoulders herself. Her hand rested briefly against him, while she adjusted the collar near his neck. Not hurried, not uncertain either. Silas covered her fingers gently with one hand. Neither stepped away immediately. Spring reached Bandera County slowly, loosening winter from the hills one pale morning at a time. Grass pushed back through the dry earth beyond Reed Hollow Ranch, and the creek west of the property carried enough water again for cattle to drink without being driven farther south. Naomi began leaving the kitchen window cracked while she worked so fresh air could move through the house with the smell of bread and cedar smoke together. The ranch sounded different now. Wagon wheels stopped outside more often. Ranch hands from neighboring properties brought torn saddle blankets for Naomi to mend, along with split coat seams, worn feed sacks, and once even a church banner needing repair before Easter service at Trinity Chapel. Naomi worked near the front room window, with her sewing basket open beside her chair, and receipts tucked carefully beneath a smooth river stone to keep them from blowing away whenever the wind picked up. Silas watched all of it quietly. One afternoon he returned from Kerrville, carrying lumber balanced in the wagon bed. Naomi stepped onto the porch as he unloaded the boards, and noticed immediately they were cut cleaner than patch material usually needed for repairs. "You replacing something?" she asked. "Front porch," he said, properly this time. By evening, warped planks that had creaked for years lay stacked beside the barn, while fresh cedar boards stretched solid beneath the porch chairs. Silas worked steadily, with sleeves rolled past his elbows, stopping only when Naomi brought him coffee in the cracked blue mug he had nearly thrown away months earlier. He accepted it with a faint smile. Thought that cup was beyond saving, so did the porch. That made him laugh softly under his breath. The house itself had begun changing in smaller ways, too. Travelers heading west toward Utopia or north toward Kerrville occasionally stopped for water or directions. And somehow Reed Hollow Ranch became the kind of place people lingered near without invitation. A ranch hand named Curtis Bell once stayed long enough to eat stew beside the stove, while Naomi repaired the lining of his coat. Another evening, Mrs. Holloway left fresh peaches wrapped in cloth near the porch rail, with no note attached. Nobody announced these things happening. They simply did. Late one afternoon, Naomi sat at the kitchen table, balancing supply receipts against a small account book she had purchased from Mercer Feed and Supply during winter. Silas entered carrying dust across his boots and stopped short when he noticed several folded property documents spread beside her sewing patterns. Naomi looked up slowly. "You were planning to sell the South grazing field." Silas removed his hat, but did not answer right away. "The deed transfer draft was tucked inside the grain invoices," she continued. "You forgot to move it." He leaned one hand against the chair back. "Feed costs didn't leave much choice. You were going to handle it without telling me." Silas stared toward the window where sunset light stretched across the pasture fencing outside. "Didn't seem fair putting more worry on you." Naomi closed the account book carefully and turned it toward him across the table. Inside, each page held neat columns written in dark ink: sewing orders, supply savings, repair exchanges with nearby ranches, lamp oil reduced by half since winter. "You keep acting like this ranch belongs only to your burdens," she said quietly. Silas lowered himself into the chair opposite hers. For several moments he simply studied the pages while evening sounds drifted softly through the open window. Distant horses shifting in the corral, wind brushing cedar branches beyond the porch. Finally, he looked at her. "You came all the way from Fort Worth," he said slowly, "and I still thought I needed to protect this place from you instead of with you." Naomi's expression softened, though only slightly. "I didn't come here looking to be carried, Silas. I know that now." The light faded gradually after supper. Naomi returned to her sewing beside the open window, while Silas repaired an old bridle strap near the stove, leather creaking quietly beneath his hands. Outside, frogs had begun sounding again near the creek after months of winter silence, and somewhere beyond the porch a horse shifted against the fence rail. For a long while neither spoke. Then Silas set down the bridle. "House sounds different these days." Naomi lifted her eyes from the stitching in her lap. The last of the sunset rested softly across the floorboards between them. "Maybe it always could have," she said, "if someone stayed long enough to listen." Silas reached across the table for the scissors lying beside her hand. Halfway there, his fingers paused. Then, gently and without hurry, he folded them around hers first, before taking the scissors and returning to his work while the evening settled quietly through Reed Hollow Ranch. And maybe that's what mattered most in the end. Not grand promises, not perfect beginnings, just two tired people who finally stopped waiting for the other one to leave. If this story stayed with you tonight, leave a simple 1 down in the comments. So I know you were here with Silas and Naomi at Reed Hollow Ranch. And if you enjoy quiet Western love stories about second chances, healing, and people finding home in unexpected places, don't forget to subscribe and come back for the next story waiting down the trail.